carrying on discussing autism and empathy, because there's a lot to say on this subject. I've been thinking about it some more, and I feel in my previous video when I was talking about, I entitled the video Empathy is easier when it's concrete, where I was talking about how when I'm watching a film where it's very obvious that people are suffering in a very sort of concrete physical way as opposed to an emotional way, I do feel moved. But thinking about it a bit further, I think I possibly refer to that as empathy when really that's more sympathy, because as I've talked about in a previous video, I think I've actually mixed up the terms myself, which I was criticising other people for doing, and then I've done it myself. I guess it's very easy to do, but when you think about it harder, I'm thinking actually empathy is more about when you perspective take, so you're putting yourself into someone else's shoes. That can either be affective, which is the emotional side of putting yourself into someone else's shoes, which is where you actually feel what they're feeling, or cognitive, which is the more intellectual, cerebral part of empathy, often known as cold empathy, which is where you don't have to feel anything, but you kind of work out what someone is thinking or feeling in a sort of more kind of considered way of perspective taking and social imagination. Putting yourself in someone else's shoes in cognitive empathy, I guess, is kind of like a Sally Ann test version of empathy. It doesn't involve any feeling. In a Sally Ann test, by the way, if you're not aware, that was an early test. I think it was devised by Simon Baron-Cohen and co. a very long time ago, where I think there's a character called Sally and a character called Anne, and I can't remember what one, but one of them puts a marble or something and the other, no, one of them has a marble, that's it, I think one of them has a marble in I don't know, bag, for the sake of argument, I can't remember exactly what it was, it might have been a box, bag or a box, doesn't really matter, and then the other one basically comes in and takes a marble and moves it, and then when they come back, one of them takes the marble and moves it, and then the person who owns the marble goes out of the room, and then when they come back you're asked where they think the marble is, and that's kind of like trying to see things from their perspective, and the idea is that they don't know that the marble's been moved, sort of thing. When I first so you're supposed to see it from their perspective of what they don't know as opposed to where the marble really is, but when I first came across that test a long time ago, and I didn't know the answer, I was like really confused by it, because I literally thought the correct answer was basically where the marble really was, because I wasn't actually perspective taking. I was thinking, oh, this is an easy test, it's obvious where the marble is, because I've just read about it being moved, so I obviously know where its real location is, and obviously that isn't what the test is about. So I basically failed the Sally Ann test the first time. I remember actually going to my mum in her bedroom, because I was like saying, oh, I just failed this test, and because it was like basically like an extra kind of revelation to me about how autistic I actually am. And my mum was like, yeah, kind of like, my mum kind of wasn't surprised, because she already knew how much I struggled with that sort of thing. Obviously now I know the answer, like it's basically a theory of mind test. So I know it now, so now I will pass the theory of mind test, because I've learned what you're supposed to say. But obviously I failed it the first time, which shows that my theory of mind is not great. And I do wonder whether a lot of autistics answer it in that way. They kind of answer where they know where the marble is, like, because it's like brownie points, you know where it is. Like in most knowledge, basically in most tests that are like testing knowledge, it's a test of concrete stuff, whereas a test of where someone thinks something isn't really it's basically not a true knowledge test. And I was treating it like a true knowledge test, basically, and I thought, this is a silly test, isn't it fairly obvious? Yeah, because when I'm reading books and I have tests in them like that, I always like to see if I get it, how you're supposed to answer it or not, so I deliberately don't look at what you're supposed to, I deliberately don't look at the actual answer, as it were. I try and work it out for myself and see if I'm right or not. And in this case, the first time I did it, I failed the Sally-Ann test. Which, as I said, was revelatory because it just proved the extent of my autism, I guess. Which kind of isn't really a surprise based upon how much I struggle in social situations. But it was quite interesting nonetheless. And I was it was shortly after I'd been diagnosed when I first came across the test, so I would have been in my early 20s. But it's actually similar to some of the sort of comprehension exercises I had to do at school, actually, and which I really struggled with. So I guess it's not a surprise, really. But interestingly, most neurotypical 4-year-olds actually pass that test. So I think most neurotypical children will pass that test at about the age of 4, but most 2 and 3-year-olds fail the test. That's neurotypical 2 to 3-year-olds fail the test because they haven't yet developed adequate theory of mind. Theory of mind is something that comes on board a bit later in normal development. It's not there straight away. That's kind of like for cold empathy. I think effective empathy is there a lot earlier. I think even babies have effective empathy. Like they can sort of like emotionally perspective take, but they can't cognitively perspective take yet. Like the emotional perspective taking is more instinctive. It's more kind of visceral, I guess. Like before thinking. So even a baby can do that, I think. Whereas cognitive empathy does require more advanced kind of higher order skills, and you need to have a certain grasp of language and things like that. So maybe, it's possible that maybe this problem with cognitive empathy and autism is down to, there are loads of different theories. Some say it's an executive functioning deficit, because executive functioning difficulties can involve problems with sort of manipulating things in your head and seeing things from different perspectives kind of thing, problem solving, that sort of thing. But it can't just be executive functioning because children with like profound intellectual disabilities who aren't autistic, who are obviously going to have executive functioning problems, they actually pass the Sally-Ann test, or when an equivalent is given to them, they actually tend to pass it. So that shows it can't be something like that. It's got to be something. It's got to be something unique to autism. But I think I'm still not too sure what it is. And it can't be just down to language differences either, because obviously like kids with intellectual disabilities are going to have problems with language, so it can't be down to that either. So it's got to be something unique to autism. Because I think even children with Down syndrome who often have intellectual disabilities, they actually pass the Sally-Ann test appropriately, because they did a control group. But also, of course, many autistics actually pass the Sally-Ann test as well, so it's not an actual fail-safe method of detecting autism, particularly those who are like high functioning and also like often, even if they fail it initially, often will later on pass it, often because they use alternative routes to kind of get to the problem, as it were. So it's not like a fail-safe method of detecting autism either. So you can pass the Sally-Ann test and still be autistic as well, by the way. And I think that's why I sometimes use more subtle tests for those who are higher functioning, in inverted commas, to kind of tease out the theory of mind test in those who are a bit more maybe able in a way. So what was I saying? So yeah, I was saying how I feel. So empathy is definitely all about perspective taking, both affective and cognitive components. And I was thinking that's why maybe when I was referring to empathy in my previous video, I probably should have said sympathy. Because for example, when I saw the movie Titanic and felt upset, and also when I saw Anne Frank's diary and felt upset, I don't think I was actually empathising with the characters, because to do that, I'd have to somehow like identify with what they were feeling, kind of thing, like resonate with their feelings, whereas to feel moved by something is more sympathy, like you feel bad for them. But feeling bad for other people and deeply moved obviously involves affect and emotion, but I think it is distinct from empathy, because empathy, to be absolutely pedantic about it, empathy is always where you perspective take. So you literally have to be feeling what the other person is feeling, almost as if you were them, basically. I'm not even actually too sure how often even normal neurotypical people do that. I think neurotypicals are maybe more able to do the whole cognitive empathy thing, like they can. Obviously they have intact theory of mind, because theory of mind is used in every single interaction. Like knowing, you have to sort of like be able to intellectually keep track of the other person's perspective all the time. Like when you're sharing information and things like that, you have to know how much to disclose, you have to know what the other person knows, or like at least you might not know exactly what they know, but you have to kind of I think it's based upon like influences of things like and previous knowledge about what they probably know and stuff like that. I don't know, but I think it's more things to do with that. And like I said in my previous video, I'm not completely without theory of mind. Like I do have some theory of mind, although I think it's been quite late to develop. So I'm not completely without it. To be completely without theory of mind, would be pretty like extreme. Like I said in my previous video, I think some autistics who are like really, really severely like I don't know, non-verbal or intellectually disabled or something like that, might actually completely lack theory of mind. But I think in most cases of autism, theory of mind is there to some extent. It's just that it's kind of basically there's a deficit. So it's not like you're completely without it, but you have an impairment in theory of mind to the extent that it significantly affects your ability to relate to other people, because you might have some basic understanding of someone else's perspective, but not enough to kind of facilitate true connection with them, sort of thing. And it's often kind of not instinctive and something that you have to work harder to process, kind of thing. And obviously, like, if there is a delay, a theory of mind delay, and like a processing lag, that's obviously going to affect social interactions, because social interactions occur very quickly and often don't allow for processing lag. So if you do have a theory of mind difficulty, that's unfortunately going to make you come across as maybe a bit more mechanical or wooden in your interactions with others, even if the other person doesn't know you're autistic, and even if you don't come across as obviously, because what is obviously, but you know what I mean, like even if the other person can't actually detect that you're autistic or whatever, I think they will still, sometimes they're like, they can't put their finger on it, but there's something a little bit awkward here. That's kind of making the interaction is a bit different, and I think that's obviously not going to help making friends and stuff. People are going to notice there's something a little bit off the mark. You know, if your theory of mind isn't fast enough, shall we say. So empathy always involves perspective taking, effective emotional perspective taking, where you feel what the other person is feeling. Often that's very instinctive, the person doesn't even need to think about it. I definitely do feel I do struggle with effective empathy, actually, because I'm not completely without it. Like, if someone's feeling stressed, I do pick up on the stress. So clearly I do have some, because that would be like, they're feeling stressed, I feel stressed. That basically is effective empathy. So clearly I do have some of it, but I don't think it is quite as full on as like what so-called normal people have. Like, I am a lot more removed from other people. I think that's the issue. Like, because there's this sort of Wi-Fi connection between me and other people, is kind of, there's a lot of static. Basically, that does kind of mean I'm at one remove from other people, and a lot of what they're feeling isn't filtering through to me. And also, of course, I really struggle with feelings as well, and knowing what they are and stuff. But with the cognitive, or so-called cold empathy, I think as I've got older, I have learned some of it, but obviously, like, not enough to help me in social situations. I know